Hi everyone, welcome to the first technical community meeting for the Essential Medicines project, which is part of the Breaking Good initiative. Before we start this evening, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, on which I'm presenting from. So for me, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. If you are on land other than Gadigal people, please feel free to share that in the chat. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. There are 5 of us in the meeting so far. Mitchell, welcome to the meeting, because I think the remaining 4 people in the meeting are part of the Breaking Good project at the University of Sydney, so we're delighted that you joined us. We've got a few key points on the agenda this evening. The first was to give a brief project update. I'm guessing, as you've been following a little bit of what's been happening on GitHub, we might not need to do as much of an update, but maybe for anyone following on this meeting online, we'll just mention that we started a new project as part of Breaking Good this year, partly in response to the fact that we couldn't work with students in high schools in the ways that we normally have, because everything has been so disrupted for the reason that we all know very well. And Yela, Kimberly and Hung led the development of the Essential Medicines project, which seeks to empower citizens, people around the world, to understand more about the medicines that we take, but also to answer questions about why we may or may not have access to the essential medicines, which are the medicines that the World Health Organization stipulates as being those that are most important for maintaining good health in different countries around the world. We've had 2 stages of the project so far. Both of these stages have been focused on the US. The first part of the project was to try and understand more about the medicines, different medicines that were available in the US. And Yela and Kim and Hung set up a really great workflow. And within a couple of weeks, some brilliant people, including one on the call, came along and said you can automate this, and coded the process. So the first results that were entered by citizen scientists helped to validate the code that had been generated by another team of contributors to the project, citizen scientists in the project. Stage 2 for the US has now launched. And this is a really interesting piece of citizen science. I guess I'm biased, but it's a little bit different to lots of the projects that we've seen, because it really challenges citizens to go out and find information that doesn't have a definitive end. So to go and research things about who owns different medicines, when that ownership was transferred, when they were discovered. And we're now at the stage of the project where we're trying to build this way of looking at the essential medicines in countries around the world. We'd like to launch, in fact we're going to, an Australian-based kind of angle on this project to coincide with National Science Week in August. And so the purpose of this meeting is to work out which bits can be automated and which bits can't, or would be more tricky, so that we don't ask people to do things that we can do with code. So I hope that was an okay summary of where we're up to. If anyone has any questions at any point, that's great, but I think we should maybe move on to the discussion of the stage 1 goals for essential medicines in Australia. Yela, Kim, would either of you like to speak to those goals or mention anything about that?
Yeah, I can talk about it a little bit. So really it's very similar to what we were doing in the US. We want to find out which medicines that are on the essential medicines list are available currently now here within Australia. So we have the Australian Therapeutic Goods Register, and the drugs need to be approved and placed on that register before they can be supplied to Australia. So we have a starting location for where we can find out that information. But yeah, mostly it's just exactly the same type of thing. So finding out whether it's currently available, is there generics available, or is it only brand name based drugs? Finding out who supplies that drug or manufactures that drug or ships it into Australia if it's manufactured overseas. Yeah, that's basically our main goals for that, collecting the same information we did for the stage 1 in the US, but for here in Australia. Do you have anything to add to that, Yayla?
Yeah, thank you, Kim. I just wanted to say that I think that this database will be sort of complementary onto the US database, because a lot of the companies or manufacturers will be the same ones and they might have different names. So I think there also needs to be a little bit of work sort of to see where there's sort of matches and when there are mismatches, to sort of identify those, so we can build on the US database, which we all know that really impacts the whole sort of essential medicines accessibility around the world, really.
Mitchell, did you want to mention anything that you've been thinking about, or any questions that you might have?
Sure. I guess the first question I would have is relating to the data sources, because once we know, I mean, with the FDA example from the US, it was made a lot easier by the fact that there was already a plain text data file that could be parsed. If there is, well, I guess the first one is the Australian Therapeutic Goods Register that I think Kimberly mentioned. That would be a good place to start. Are there any other data sources that you're aware of right now?
So we haven't looked much further past this one. All the information that we require is available from this website, but I'm not sure whether it's in a file type that's accessible, because some of the information is just in PDF files. So I'm not sure, like it's not in a database in a searchable thing in the same way. You can search for the products and it comes up with some of the information, but to collect the extra things, you have to download the PDFs and read through them.
Okay. That could be a little bit complicated. I haven't passed any PDF format before, but to my understanding, it can just be reduced down to text. So there's probably a way to extract it. I can look into that.
Mm-hmm. And there's possibly a way to automate some of the process, but not all of the process. So I guess that's sort of what we wanted to get feedback from during this meeting, to understand what are the opportunities or options for automation, and what the community thinks, or the people that have more expertise in coding than we do, what they think needs to be manually collected.
Hung, I know you're doing a wonderful job taking minutes here, but it goes without saying that you should jump in at any point if you want to mention something. I hope you know that.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, great. You just look so serious and studious that I wasn't interrupting you for a second.
Doesn't want to miss anything.
Yeah, you're so good at this. Thanks, Hung. Yeah, so I think one of the things that we could do is definitely look for more sources of information, but we can see that if there isn't a way to find this information so easily in one place, there's still kind of a drive to try and collect this information to put it into one database eventually with some of the other information.
Yep.
So Kim, did you want to present or show us like a screen share of what the data looks like?
Sure. So I did share the link, so if anyone wants to click that, they can look at that themselves. But I can also share my screen and go through and I'll do Yayla's favorite drug.
Avakavir.
Yeah. First one on the list in alphabetical order.
You want to start with?
Okay, so basically this is just the website. So if you search into Google Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, or even the abbreviated form ARTG, it should come up as like the first option. And then you can search here by clicking on this button. And it's very similar to what we had when we looked at the FDA Orange Book. You can search by whatever you want. So we'll do abacavir. So I assume that we would probably search in the same way that we did for the US by looking at the listed names that are on the essential medicines list. So once you search it, basically it comes up with all the different results, gives you an identification number and the product name, the active ingredients and the sponsor. And then most of them, but not all of them, will also have these PDFs attached for product information and customer medicines information. The CMI one doesn't really contain anything additional, but the product information one does. I guess from the product name though, you can also get a lot more information. They normally do, so some of them tell you about the strength. So you can see in the first one here, it tells us that it's a combination medicine, but it has the abacavir at 600 milligrams as the sulfate and the lamivudine at 300 milligrams. And it also tells us that it's a tablet, so we know about the form, and generally from the form we can also determine what the route of administration is. So I think if we can extract information from the results like this, it probably won't be so bad. We'll be able to get a lot of it because most of them are quite comprehensive in the way that the first few examples are there. Yeah, then the extra information that we needed is generally in the product information. You have to accept that you're okay to read it. But mostly it's similar to what we previously had. There's a lot of extra information that's not relevant to what we need to collect. So information about side effects and dosage and administration and those types of things. But between what pops up from the search and what pops up in this PDF, all the information that we require is available. Yeah, there's lots of pages of stuff, but you can go through that on your own if you wish.
And what were the things, I can't remember, that we were looking for that were only in the PDF and not in the text files?
Yeah, I can't remember either. But if I just go back to the other thing, we can work out which one is which, because the things we wanted was an identification number and then the name, whether it's got a brand name or just a generic name.
So the Kivexa, that would be the trade name?
Yeah, if it's capitalized, I believe that then that is a trade name.
Mm-hmm.
If it's in small letters, just like.
If I remember correctly, this is a different trade name than the one that the same sponsor has in the US. Am I correct?
Yeah, so that's also another thing that will be interesting for us to look at. You was mentioning about how sometimes the sponsors or the manufacturers might be the same but have different names. That's also something that happens with the trade names. Sometimes they'll have different names in different countries, but they may be made by the same person.
Mm-hmm.
Or the same company, I should say. Yeah, I'm trying to remember what that information was in the product information. It wasn't in the other. I think it was mostly the strengths, because not all the product names had the strengths within them. But yeah.
Maybe the years of approval.
Yeah, that was the other thing. So at the very bottom of the PDFs, it has when it was first placed on the register.
Does that have a consistent format in the PDF?
Yes, I believe so. I'll just scroll to the bottom so that you can see what it looks like.
I'm sorry, yeah. I have to bring some battery from my computer.
So at the bottom, they generally have these same sections. They have what schedule it's under, the sponsor, the date of first approval, and then a date of revision. So if this product information has been revised at any stage, they update that. And then some will have this summary where they've taken note of what changes they've made. But they all nearly have this date of first approval.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone I've looked at, it's been in the same format.
And are you interested in the first approval or the most recent?
I think for all of them, it just says the date that medicine was first approved, not first approved for that sponsor or anything like that. So I'm not sure if we will be able to collect that information in the same way. I think we would have to look at a few more examples and see what happens with them.
I think if it's possible to collect both, it would be good. If that doesn't overly complicate things.
No, it's as easy to get both as it is to get one of them. Yeah.
So I guess linked to this, although of course not, from the output end, because we're thinking about how we can collect this data, but how we can meaningfully share this with people in the form of a database. So this is another kind of point of discussion. So I'm moving along the agenda, but I know we might pop back to some of these discussions, which is about different requirements that we might have for a database. And the team is planning to submit a grant. I'm going to get the acronym wrong now, but there's a grant proposal due, or a grant due at the end of the month to the Australian Data. I can't remember the acronym. I'll come back to that. I should have written that down. That we're hoping if we're successful, we might get some funding to assist with building that database. And more broadly speaking, to try and build kind of a blueprint for databases that are generated from data collected by citizens, because that's something that I think has been underexplored, particularly in Australia. So we were also keen to discuss with you, Mitchell, some of those requirements for a database like that. Any thoughts that you might have about things that might be important, which kind of goes hand in hand with planning how we might extract some of this data, either through automation or through this kind of crowdsourced citizen approach.
So the first thing I'll say is I don't have a lot of experience with databases at all. I'm actually a chemist, so I kind of do some coding through my work. I'm a computational chemist. One of the first things I would think of is longevity. So you'd want to make sure that wherever the database is getting hosted, whether that's on servers at University of Sydney or through Amazon Web Services, for example, that's around for the next 5 to 10 years, because you see a lot of these databases come up where, with the best of intentions and with good quality data, if they're not supported long-term through some mechanism, then it doesn't become very useful to people. What was the second part of your question again?
Well, I don't know if I didn't, maybe I didn't phrase it very well, to be honest. We were sort of thinking if there's the way that we might share different parts of this data. So I guess this is a naive perspective as somebody who's not a coder at all, but we can imagine sharing in that database the kind of the outputs of whatever the inputs to the coding is, but we also need to think about how we can share crowdsourced or citizen generated data that hasn't been automated. So it might be a bit messier. It'll need a bit more cleaning, I would imagine, than kind of automated data extraction. So we just wanted to have a bit of a discussion to see if anyone had any perspectives on that. And we'll probably continue these on GitHub or offline, but we thought we'd raise it in this meeting.
So this is data that ideally would be sort of in its unfinished form and that citizen scientists themselves could modify and refine?
I think that's part of the question, part of the unanswered question. So for example, do we want to have a database whereby a citizen gathers some data? So I'll use an example. Say they have unearthed information about how a medicine has changed ownership over time, and they've got that information from multiple different web sources. So if they input this information, do we want it to be sort of automatically populated in the public database? If two people go and do the same piece of research, do we show all of the data generated, or do we have a step before that or several steps before that where we clean the data? At which stage do we kind of have a check and balance, or to what extent do we kind of have it a little bit like a wiki where the data that is there is trusted or accepted as being the best data until it's improved by somebody else's addition or edit to the data? So I think there's a few questions about how kind of instantaneous the database is, or whether there are several steps before information goes into the public repository.
Mm-hmm.
I think another question, sorry for interrupting, is especially in stage 2 of essential medicines, where we're asking a little bit more complex questions, and we're asking basically to go and do a little bit more in-depth research into the essential medicines, into their history, into different life events. And some of this information will be very maybe easier to find for some medicines, but more difficult to find for others. And for some medicines, it may be very much incomplete. So just sort of thinking of how to structure that, knowing that a lot of the information is not available, or at least we haven't found it yet, and how to still put that in a database without it sort of interrupting the flow, and still be able to sort of ask queries on the database without that being a problem.
I guess there are two questions about format. So the first is whether you want to have a database that is kind of similar to the ARTG one that I have on my screen here, where you type in a query, like you know the name of, or you know what sort of information you're looking for, and you query the database and it returns the relevant information back to you. In that case, you always want to have sort of a sanitization layer between input that someone has provided you. You sanitize that before you can then present that to the people that try and look for it. That's just a cybersecurity, a safety thing. If you want to have a database which is not strictly a database, but is more sort of a website or a wiki, as Alice mentioned, I think, then that can be a little bit more free-form. But it would probably require either a mechanism for people that you don't know to modify it, or someone in between to add the information that comes in, which could be quite difficult. The last thing about what was it? Yeah, that's right. The life cycle of the drugs, the stage 2. That is a difficult question, actually. I did think of that when it first came up, whether that too could be automated like the stage 1. But like you mentioned, because the data sources are all spread out, and I mean, it's not necessarily clear what data is there until you find it. It's difficult to say how that would be automated. In terms of presentation, I mean, I quite like the visual thing that I saw someone put up on the blog, the Breaking Good blog,
Yep.
But I think that would probably be better done as sort of like a time series, right? Where you go through from its inception to its most recent update, and you highlight the relevant events.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be, because Kim did a lovely job of putting together that diagram, but that's too time consuming for every medicine. So if there was a way to input that data in a way that it was coded into a visual or a time series, as you mentioned, but if there was some way to kind of make that look beautiful or illustrative rather than having to read text, I think that would be quite a powerful piece of automation.
You could certainly automate the process of visualizing the data once you have it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that could be done with caveats. I mean, like, obviously, if there's hundreds of pieces of data for one drug and 3 or 4 for the next drug, it's going to be difficult to fit hundreds of pieces of data in one image. So there'll have to be caveats with how that's represented. But
yeah,
I mean, you can do some human intervention in that case.
Yeah, exactly. I think then you'd pick the key transformations or the
Sure.
biggest changes in price, or something that was a momentous life event, I guess, for the medicine.
Actually, so knowing what those momentous life events would help a lot as well. Like you say, the price changes, or if the name changes, or if ownership changes in particular.
Or if it gets repurposed or reused in a combination with another medicine, that would, I guess that's a divergent one, but if it suddenly gets combined with another drug and becomes a new therapy, there's a combination. But I guess we're still, and correct me if I'm wrong, Hung or Kimberly or Yela, I guess we're still at the early stages of that part. So we need a few more entries to sort of pick up on what those, I mean, we can kind of guess what they are, but to see whether these important events are triggered a number of times, in many medicines, or whether it's a rare event or, a normal occurrence, if that makes sense. That's part of what we're trying to understand, really. How often, what is the average number of times that a medicine changes ownership or changes price, or how long from its discovery does it become widely manufactured as a generic, and then we can start, once we have this data, we can start to look for patterns and trends in that data. But it's too difficult to do without it, and we hope that other people eventually might use this database to do some of that kind of research, that it will be useful as a tool for others. Did anyone else want to raise any questions or points or anything that isn't on the the agenda?
I just will say that it's good to hear that we can possibly automate the visualization of the data, because that does take a long time, and I didn't want to have to sit there and do that.
I think that's not good use of human time, unless somebody wants to work on it artistically, unless that's their passion and their drive. I think for people who might want to do some reactions in the lab instead, it might be, they might prefer to do something else. If there's any other business, maybe we should start to move towards what the next steps are. So what do we need to do in order to have some action items, and what might they be? I guess a few that spring to mind for me are for us to have a look and see if there are any other sources of information other than the Therapeutic Goods Register in Australia. And maybe for us to do look through a few sets of these compounds that are being worked on by citizen scientists at the moment as part of stage 2 to look for these key life events. And then maybe to start thinking about ways that we can automate the collection of this data or not. Like, it's as important for us to know the things that we can't automate so we can focus on them for the crowdsourcing. And then I guess another piece would be to explore people who might be interested in doing the automated data visualization. Does anyone have any suggestions or happy to take any of these action items upon themselves, or any other things that they think we should be thinking about?
I'm happy to look into the automation of going through the ARTG. I'm partly also interested to know whether I can extract data from PDFs. I've had a quick Google during the meeting, and it seems very possible. It'll be a nice little challenge. I guess to get started, I'd need to know like a couple of example drugs. Would they be similar to the ones from the last set?
That will be exactly the same.
Okay, great.
So,
That's easy then.
I have the list already, I think.
Yeah, and the quantities that you want out of the drugs, the information that you want, is all the same as well?
Yeah, exactly the same as what we got for the US. They might be slightly different in terms of their like naming, like on the might say sponsor instead of market applicant holder.
Yeah, okay.
But I think it's quite intuitive, and you know which one's which.
Okay,
but yeah,
cool.
Same information, and similar to what we did with the US in collecting the information for the identification as well. Having an identification number for those, I think, would be helpful too.
Yeah, sure.
And another thing that I would be really interested to see, and I think we could also automate this, is that once we have a database, or at least a few of the entries, to try and compare them to the US database and see how they align. And if they align well, to sort of build them into a database, maybe as 2 separate tables, but that have sort of a connection between them.
Mm-hmm.
And then so also identify where they align, but also where they do not.
Mm-hmm.
So where there are additional medicines in Australia that are not available in the US, and vice versa.
Yeah, that seems really interesting. Sort of comparing, to use Mitchell's language from before, like comparing their time series almost, like whether things change at similar times or in similar time frames, and whether the same key events or life events are mirrored between Australia and America.
So I think that's sort of the next stage after we understand how to automate the data collection, is to understand if and how to automate the comparison, and then build it into a sort of combined database.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think we also need to post some of this stuff to GitHub to see if anyone else wants to join in. And we're thinking also, Mitchell, about how we share some of what we've done, because we were thinking about trying to publish at least in blog posts, but maybe in more kind of in peer-reviewed places at different stages along this project, rather than waiting, until the end, because it's hard to say exactly when the end will be. So if you have any ideas about that too, and you'd like to be part of publishing some of this information, of course, you're extremely warmly invited to be part of that. Or if you have any ideas for how to share different, kind of different chapters relating to the stages.
Okay, thanks. I'll have a think on that. The blog posting sounds kind of fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think the next stage after we have this, and sort of looking at the more the future, but the close future, I guess, is that we are going to have a National Science Week event around this and a hackathon that we are planning. And so we want to do, I guess, a combination of stage 1 and stage 2 of data collection. So whatever cannot be automated from stage 1, we will want to collect during this hackathon, but also going, I guess, further, since we recognize that a lot of the information we collected in stage 1 can be automated. We feel this is a good opportunity to go beyond what we did in stage 1. So I think it will be sort of a hybrid between the 2 stages, and we can start planning that more specifically once we know what we are able and what we are not able to automate.
And just for your diary, Mitchell, and we'll put this on the GitHub thread too, we know that we're going to do a National Science Week talk and mini hackathon on the 18th of August. And then on the 20th, we're going to try and run a 12-hour hackathon. So if you're interested in being a part of both or either of those things, either for the whole time or for half an hour or for an hour, again, we warmly invite you. You know, you're part of this project, and you can be as much a part of anything as you have time or you know, motivation to do so.
Cool. I'll keep it free.
Mm-hmm.
Just going back to some of the things Alice mentioned. So I'll also have a look and see if I can, or another look, because I've obviously already looked. I found the Australian Register stuff, but I'll have a look and see if there's any other stuff as well that I can find, and I'll share that on GitHub if I do find anything. So, and then maybe Mitchell, you can give us some idea on whether or not you think that might be able to be automated or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to sign up for that one.
Yeah, can do. I like working through GitHub. I find it works reasonably well.
I'm happy to kind of have a go at finding some people who are interested in data visualization or automation, or like linking kind of a data visualizer to the automated process. But I think I'll hold off on doing that for a little bit, because I think we don't exactly know what we want to communicate visually yet. So you can put that action item on me to lead the kind of hunt, but I'm not going to do anything on it for a little while, because I think we need a bit more information first.
And I think also maybe we can sort of play around manually with a few different visualization styles, and just see what works best with the different data that we have. Mm-hmm. And then maybe that will assist also the automation process.
Okay.
Do we have a time frame for when we want the data extracted?
I think we need to know I think we need to have formulated very clearly in the next couple of weeks, so in a fortnight's time, what we're going to get people to do for the Australian part of this project in National Science Week, because it needs to be really clearly communicated. And if we're going to try and run this through some schools, which we've talked about in the team, we need to have a really clear scaffolding for teachers who might do this with their students, for example. So I think there's kind of almost 2 deadlines, like the deadline of deciding what we're going to do as part of this hackathon, and then the longer sort of deadline of this stage of the project. So maybe if we can have a quick meeting or meet via GitHub in a couple of weeks' time, it would be good to kind of set up the ideas for this project by then.
I don't think there's like a real solid deadline for when the data needs to be extracted, but we definitely do need to know what can and what can't be like within this 2 weeks that Alice is talking about, because we do need that time to plan that event, and we don't want to be rushed. And, you know, like Alice said, it's going to take a bit of work to make sure it's scaffolded and everything so we can achieve what we're hoping to achieve. So yeah, don't think there's a hard deadline on when it needs to, like, you know, be there, but just what we can and what we can't is probably the most important parts.
Yeah, no worries.
So should we set up a meeting for the same time, like 2 weeks on Monday? And then this time it's late for an all Australian crowd, but if we're lucky enough to be joined by some friends from other countries, maybe it's convenient for them. And if we get no takers, we can always make it a friendlier time in the day for an Australian meeting. Would
Yeah, that
be
sounds
okay?
good.
I'm happy.
Okay, great. Well, I might start recording the meeting unless anyone has anything else to say that they would like to be noted in the minutes. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now.